Only 12 men have left their footprints on the surface of the moon. 2 of them are with us here. Only 3 men have ever flown a crippled spacecraft back to Earth from near the moon. 1 of them is with us. Only 2 American fighter pilots achieved ace status in Vietnam by shooting down 5 enemy aircraft. 1 of them is with us. And only 1 man was the first to fly the world's fastest airplane. He is with us. These 5 men are true legends of aerospace.
That's 1 small step for man, 1 giant leap for mankind.
The man who took that small step and giant leap was Neil Armstrong. He spoke those words on 20 July 1969 as he stepped onto the surface of the moon. He was the first human ever to set foot on a celestial body other than our home planet, Earth. Neil had been a naval aviator who'd seen combat action in Korea and a civilian test pilot in the X-15 before he joined NASA's astronaut program. As commander of Apollo 11, Neil, along with lunar lander pilot Buzz Aldrin and command module pilot Mike Collins, blasted off for the moon on 16 July 1969. Imagine a 35-story building being lifted straight off the deck by 160 million horsepower of rocket propulsion, and you'll have an idea of what that launch was like. Despite that, Neil's pulse never went above 109. The linked command, service, and lunar lander modules covered the 380,000 kilometers between Earth and the Moon in 3 days, 3 hours, 49 minutes. Average speed, 5,000 kilometers an hour. On 20 July, Neil and Buzz got into the lunar lander, undocked from the command module, leaving Collins to orbit the Moon, descended to the surface of the Moon. The autopilot slowed the craft with retro rockets, but when it looked like the lander was likely to overshoot its target and smash into a jagged crater, Neil took manual control, found a safe area, and brought the lander, named Eagle, to rest. He had less than 1 minute of fuel left in his fuel tanks.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Armstrong and Aldrin skipped a planned rest period, depressurized Eagle, opened the hatch, and Neil descended the ladder to make history. There are only 5 photographs partially showing Neil or his reflection on the surface of the moon. That's because he, not Buzz, carried the still camera. Neil's reflection in Buzz's visor is the best still photo of Neil on the moon. The crew spent 21.5 hours on the moon, 2.5 of those hours walking and working on the surface. Eagle blasted off from the moon at 17 hours 54 minutes on 21 July and docked with Columbia. They jettisoned the lander and flew back to Earth. The command capsule splashed down in the Pacific just before dawn on 24 July 1969. It's estimated that 450 million people around our globe heard Neil say one small step live on radio or television. At that time, that was well over 10% of the world's population.
It's a rock composed of many fragments of many sizes and many shapes. When we return this rock, or some of the others like it, to Houston, we'd like to share a piece of this rock with so many of the countries throughout the world. We hope that this will be a symbol of what our feelings are, what the feelings of the Apollo program are, and a symbol of mankind that we can live in peace and harmony in the future.
That symbolic rock, called the Goodwill Rock, is in the hand of Eugene Cernan, commander of Apollo 17, the last man to leave his footprints on the moon. Today, pieces of that rock are in museums all over the world. Apollo 17 also has a long list of firsts and other superlatives. It was the first manned spacecraft launched at night, a spectacular sight. It was the longest manned lunar landing flight. Cernan and Jack Schmitt, the lunar lander pilot, spent the most time on the moon's surface and returned to Earth the largest sample of lunar rocks, dust, and soil. And 29,000 kilometers from home, the crew took this picture, the blue marble, the most famous photograph of Earth from space. Eugene Cernan was a naval aviator when he was selected to join the astronaut program. He orbited the moon in Apollo 10 and landed on it as commander of Apollo 17. He was one of only 3 men to journey twice to the moon. Ron Evans stayed in lunar orbit in the command module. Down on the moon, Gene and Jack Schmitt spent 22 hours exploring the surface. Using a lunar rover, they covered 35 kilometers at a barren valley called Taurus Littrow.
You know, Jack, when we finish with station 8, we will have covered this whole valley from corner to corner.
They even tried their hand at auto body work. They fixed the rover's broken fender with a lunar map, tape, and clamps to keep the wheel from spraying dust all over them. And in the moon's low gravity, they played soccer with a lunar boulder.
Just don't stub your toe.
Gene got as close as a human ever will to traveling like a kangaroo.
99, proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition.
And when it came time to leave the moon, a color video camera left behind transmitted these unforgettable images back to Earth. An onboard camera showed the lander's descent stage left behind on the moon. And cameras on the command module and lander recorded the docking approach above the moon.
Good to have you all back up here.
On 19 December 1972, 12 days after launch, Apollo 17 had a picture-perfect splashdown in the Pacific.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Yes. Houston, we've had a problem.
Houston, we have a problem. Those 4 words marked the beginning of a 4-day nail-biting adventure that had the whole planet on edge. Through it all, no one seemed calmer and more collected than the crew of the badly damaged Apollo 13 spacecraft commanded by Jim Lovell.
Ignition, Flight.
Roger. Roger. Clock start, Flight. Roger.
Let's just go, all engines.
Roger. Okay, Fido, how's it look?
Looks good here, Flight. Good agreement.
Okay, Booster, how do you look?
That's once he looks good, Flight.
Okay, Capcom, we go.
When Apollo 13 launched, the afternoon of 11 April 1970, Jim broke a record. He became the first American to fly in space 4 times, and he was on track to become the 5th man to actually walk on the moon. As Apollo 13 sped toward its rendezvous with the moon, an explosion rocked the spacecraft. Lovell, Jack Schweigert, the command module pilot, and Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot, were in grave danger. The blast disabled the service module, and all of its oxygen supply quickly vented into space. Lovell, Hayes, and Schweigert took refuge in the lunar lander, which had its own independent life support system. But there was a problem. The lander's breathing system was designed to keep just 2 astronauts alive for just 2 days on the moon. Now it had to be stretched to keep 3 men alive for 5 days. Instead of being home base on the moon, the lander became an overcrowded and undersupplied lifeboat in space. Now, landing on the moon was impossible. The big question was whether Apollo 13 could get home, to Earth. At 5,000 kilometers an hour, you can't just make a U-turn, even in the void of space. Apollo 13 had to continue on to the moon and orbit it, in effect, using the moon's gravity like a slingshot to fling the spacecraft back toward Earth. Lovell and the crew used the lander's descent engine 3 times to position Apollo 13 for the trip home. Crews on the ground and Lovell's team on board the lander improvised and innovated as they went, making do with whatever worked. The whole world was watching this tense drama on television, but they weren't seeing Lovell and the crew. To conserve electrical power, no more live TV broadcasts came from Apollo 13. These images were filmed by the crew at the time, but were not transmitted back home. The low power levels even made voice communications difficult, and to save batteries, the lander was powered down to the lowest possible level. It got cold, but an even greater threat was the astronauts' own breath. They were exhaling more carbon dioxide than the lander's lithium hydroxide filters could handle, and the abundant supply of lithium hydroxide in the command module was stored in canisters that were incompatible with the landers. It was possible that the crew could be asphyxiated by their own breath. In a simulator on the ground, engineers came up with a jerry-rigged solution. Following ground crew instructions, Lovell and the others attached the command module's cube-shaped canisters to the lander's circular canister sockets using a hose from a spacesuit. They called this the mailbox. It was crude, but it saved their lives. Near Earth, the crew jettisoned the lander and service modules and took these pictures of the damage. The command module was aptly named Odyssey. When it splashed down in the Pacific on 17 April 1970, the world and the crew breathed a collective sigh of relief.
Everything that I'd studied, learned, experienced, worked for 30 years, all came together and gelled in an instant in time. So it was by far the most perfect mission that I was ever involved in.
That's General Steve Ritchie, the only Air Force pilot to become an ace in the Vietnam War, and the only American pilot in history to down 5 MiG-21s. More about that perfect mission in a bit. By 1969, Steve had already served one tour in country and was back home teaching air-to-air tactics for the Air Force. But Steve volunteered to go back to combat. He felt his skills were needed in Vietnam, where supersonic Soviet-built MiG-21s were taking a serious toll on our aircraft. The Phantom 4 was our answer to the MiG-21. It was faster, but the MiG had a tighter turning radius. The Phantom's power gave it the edge in vertical maneuvers. Steve killed his first MiG-21 on 10 May 1972. This History Channel animation shows how he took out the MiG with the second of 2 Sparrow missiles. Steve got his second MiG 3 weeks later. Then came kills 3 and 4, that most perfect mission. Steve got 2 MiG-21s on the same day, 8 July 1972. Our forces had intercepted North Vietnamese air-to-ground communications, and Steve got a dire warning about a flight of MiGs.
I got a call indicating that they had us in sight and they were cleared to fire. And that information, at best, was about 40 to 60 seconds old. And we had no visual. So that gets your attention.
2 MiGs were on Ritchie 6. He executed a hard left turn, turning 180 to find them. The first MiG flashed past him.
We passed canopy to canopy about 1,000 feet from each other, doing about 600 miles an hour each, closing at about 1,200 miles an hour. Just subsonic. I could actually see the pilot in the cockpit.
Instead of turning after the first MiG, which would have left the second one on his tail, Steve dropped down, waited for the second Bandit, and when that one passed by, he turned his Phantom hard left, pulling more than 6 Gs. Steve maneuvered into position, ripple-fired 2 Sparrows, and blew the MiG apart. The action was so close and fast that Steve flew through the MiG's debris, lightly damaging the skin of his own left wing. The first MiG was now on the tail of Steve's Dash 4, so he maneuvered his Phantom behind the MiG, which gave up the chase and dove. Steve stayed on him, launched a Sparrow, and took him out. He had killed 2 bandits in less than a minute and a half. Steve's 5th MiG-21 kill was in the skies near Hanoi on 28 August 1972, when his flight encountered a pair of MiGs heading back to base. The MiGs were 5,000 to 8,000 feet above the Phantoms. From 4 miles out, Steve fired his first 2 Sparrows, trying to get the MiGs to maneuver, which would slow them down. That didn't work. Missiles 3 and 4 were a different story.
I'm now supersonic, doing about 1.2 Mach. They're still subsonic. And I got a radar lock on, fired 2 missiles. The first one appeared to go by on the right side of the MiG, and he broke left, which solved the problem for the 4th missile.
With that kill, Steve became the Air Force's first and only pilot ace of the Vietnam War. He remains the country's last pilot ace. We're in fast company today. Astronauts whose spacecraft flew to the moon at 5,000 kilometers an hour, a jet fighter ace who flew in combat at Mach speeds. Even in this group, Bob Gilliland's accomplishments shine. He has logged more Mach 2 and Mach 3 experimental flight test time than any other pilot. Bob's career of flying fast got off to a modest start. He soloed in 1949 in a T-6 Texan, which had a top speed of 208 miles an hour. But things quickly got a lot faster. In the Korean War, Bob flew the F-84 Thunderjet. That's a fighter bomber with a cruising speed of 475 miles an hour that was capable of hitting 622 miles an hour. In 1960, Bob joined Lockheed, working as a test pilot at the company's famous secret Skunk Works, it was called, in California. There, he flew the F-104 Starfighter, the first combat aircraft capable of sustained Mach 2 flight. It was this plane, the highly secret Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, that would seal Bob's place in aviation history. On 22 December 1964, Bob climbed into the cockpit of the Blackbird and took it up for its very first flight. The SR-71 roared skyward with maximum afterburner thrust. A legendary pilot was taking the first ever flight in a legendary airplane. Bob took the Blackbird to 50,000 feet and hit Mach 1, an amazing start for an amazing airplane. Although the Blackbird maiden flight was 45 years ago and the plane was retired by the Air Force in 1998, to this day, the SR-71 holds the world's record for the fastest and highest flying, air-breathing, manned aircraft. SR-71s have flown at nearly 2,200 miles an hour at an altitude of 85,000 feet. It's flown coast to coast in under 2 hours, and from New York to London in 1 hour, 54 minutes, 56 seconds, an average speed of Mach 2.68. As the SR-71 program grew, Bob continued to be the first pilot to fly each Blackbird that became operational, a job that gave him that world record of logging more experimental supersonic flight test time above Mach 2 and Mach 3 than any other pilot. Over his career, Bob has logged 6,500 hours of flight time.